Have you ever wondered why we're so obsessed with categorizing everything as good or evil? It's fascinating how deeply ingrained this binary thinking is in our consciousness. You wake up, scroll through social media, and immediately your mind begins sorting. This is good, that's bad. This is virtuous, that's immoral. But what if I told you that this most fundamental distinction, this constant moral categorization, isn't some divine truth, but rather a sophisticated invention? An invention with a specific purpose, a specific history, and specific beneficiaries. Think about it. When was the last time you questioned where your moral compass came from? We accept without hesitation that certain actions are good and others are evil. But have you ever stopped to ask why? Who decided these categories? And more importantly, what happens when we look beyond them? The tablets of morality we've been handed don't just shape our judgments. They shape our entire reality. They determine who we trust, how we vote, what we buy, who we love, and perhaps most crucially, how we view ourselves. But what if these tablets were cracking? What if, upon closer inspection, they revealed themselves not as timeless truths, but as human creations designed to serve very human purposes? This isn't just philosophical pondering. The implications reach into every corner of your daily life. That voice in your head judging your actions, those feelings of guilt or righteousness, what if they're all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what morality actually is? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche asked these uncomfortable questions over a century ago, and the answers he uncovered were so unsettling that many have tried to bury them ever since. Today, we're going to examine what he found when he dared to look beyond good and evil. What if the most radical act isn't choosing between good and evil, but questioning whether the distinction itself is real? Before we dive into Nietzsche's discoveries, let's observe something peculiar. Morality changes dramatically across time and cultures, yet each society believes their version is absolute truth. This creates an obvious contradiction. How can something be both absolute and constantly changing? Consider how moral judgments that were once universal are now considered barbaric. Public executions were once moral celebrations. Slavery was defended by the most educated and moral thinkers. Women were denied basic rights based on moral reasoning. Even today, what's considered morally obvious in one culture can be morally abhorrent in another. If you look closely at history, you'll notice a pattern. When moral systems change, they don't typically evolve because people discovered some deeper truth. Rather, they change when power structures change. New rulers, new gods, new economic systems, and suddenly, new moralities emerge. Isn't that strange? If morality were truly about eternal truths, wouldn't it remain consistent regardless of who holds power? Another anomaly. Notice how moral rules often seem to benefit those who create and enforce them. Religious authorities determine which behaviors are sinful, while simultaneously offering themselves as the gatekeepers of forgiveness. Political leaders define which actions are patriotic or treasonous in ways that consolidate their authority. Even in families and workplaces, rules about what's appropriate often mysteriously align with maintaining the status quo. Then there's the strangest pattern of all. The more you study any moral system in detail, the more internal contradictions you find. We're told to be honest, but also that white lies are kind. We're told to be generous, but not to enable bad behavior. We're told to love our neighbor, but to punish the wicked. Every moral rule seems to come with exceptions that increasingly complicate the picture. Most peculiarly, those who question moral frameworks are immediately branded as immoral, creating a perfect defense mechanism against scrutiny. It's like a spell that prevents you from examining the spell itself. What's truly curious is how desperately we cling to these moral frameworks despite their obvious inconsistencies. Why do we need to believe so strongly in absolute good and evil? What function does this serve? And why do we feel such emotional resistance to questioning these categories? This is where Nietzsche enters the picture, asking not whether this moral rule or that moral rule is correct, but something far more radical. What if morality itself isn't what we think it is? What if our entire understanding of good and evil serves a purpose we've never considered? Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't always the radical questioner of morality we now recognize. Born in 1844 in Prussia, he was the son of a Lutheran pastor and destined for a religious life. Young Friedrich was so pious that his schoolmates nicknamed him the Little Pastor. His father died when Friedrich was only 4 years old, a traumatic event that would shape his relationship with authority, truth, and the divine. Picture a specific moment. The young Nietzsche, surrounded by theological texts in his late father's study, absorbing the rigid moral framework of 19th-century Protestant Germany. The world he inhabited was one where Christian morality wasn't just one perspective. It was the unquestioned foundation of society, politics, and personal identity. This wasn't a time of casual religious belief. It was a world saturated with moral certainty. Nietzsche's exceptional intellect led him to become the youngest person ever appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel at just 24 years old. As a philologist, a scholar of language and texts, Nietzsche was trained to look beneath the surface of words, to trace their histories, and to uncover their hidden meanings. This methodical approach to language would become his key to unlocking the secret history of morality. But something happened to Nietzsche that made him uniquely qualified to see through the moral structures others took for granted. Throughout his life, he suffered from debilitating migraines, stomach ailments, and deteriorating vision that left him nearly blind. His physical suffering pushed him to the margins of society, unable to work consistently, often isolated, and in constant pain. This outsider position gave him a perspective few philosophers had. Imagine Nietzsche in 1879, walking painfully through the Swiss mountains, seeking relief from his ailments. It was during these solitary walks, cut off from society's constant moral reinforcement, that he began to see morality not as divine command, but as a human creation with a history that could be traced. Unlike philosophers before him who debated which moral rules were correct, Nietzsche asked a different question. What if we examine morality itself as a phenomenon? What if we look at it not as eternal truth, but as something that evolved and served specific purposes? This was revolutionary. While others were arguing about which morality was best, Nietzsche stepped back and asked why we have morality at all. What psychological needs does it serve? Who benefits from these systems? What would happen if we saw beyond good and evil? This wasn't just philosophical speculation for Nietzsche. His physical suffering had shown him how fragile human life is, how brief our existence, and how precious our time. He couldn't bear the thought that humans might waste their limited lives serving moral systems that constrained rather than liberated them. So as we follow Nietzsche on his investigation into the origins of morality, remember, this isn't just academic inquiry. For Nietzsche, this was about reclaiming human potential. But before we can understand his solution, we need to understand the problem he uncovered. What exactly did Nietzsche discover when he began to trace the history of good and evil? Nietzsche's investigation began with a simple observation that others had overlooked. Words themselves contain historical clues. In his groundbreaking work, On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, he examined how moral language evolved across different cultures and time periods. What he discovered was revealing. In ancient languages, the words for good originally didn't have moral connotations at all. In Greek, Latin, and Germanic languages, the original terms for good, agathos, bonus, gut, primarily meant noble, powerful, or of high birth. The earliest meaning of good wasn't about kindness or charity. It simply meant belonging to the aristocratic class. Similarly, bad, kakos, malus, schlecht, initially meant common, lowly, or plebeian. This linguistic evidence suggested something profound. Morality didn't originate from divine command or universal truth. It began as a simple class distinction, the powerful defining themselves as good and others as bad. This wasn't about behavior, but about social position. Nietzsche called this original framework master morality. In this system, the powerful considered themselves good, not because they followed rules, but because they embodied strength, confidence, and the ability to impose their will. Their opposites weren't evil, just bad, in the sense of being weak, timid, or ineffective. But then something happened that Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality, one of history's most significant psychological revolutions. Those who lacked power couldn't win through strength, so they created a new moral framework. They inverted the values, claiming that the powerful weren't good but evil, while the weak were actually good. We can see this transformation in ancient Judea under Roman occupation. Unable to defeat Rome militarily, a new moral language emerged where Roman virtues like strength, pride, and dominance were recast as sins. Meanwhile, the conditions of the powerless, meekness, humility, suffering, were elevated as virtues. Nietzsche wasn't making a simplistic claim that Christianity invented morality. Rather, he identified a historical pattern where oppressed groups throughout history have used moral language to redefine their situation. When you can't win through strength, you change the rules of the game. To understand this process, Nietzsche introduced the concept of ressentiment, a psychological state where powerlessness transforms into moral indignation. When people cannot express their frustrations directly, these feelings don't disappear. Instead, they're sublimated into moral condemnation. Consider a specific example Nietzsche might have witnessed in 19th century Germany. A wealthy industrialist strides confidently through town in expensive clothes, displaying his success without shame. Those who cannot achieve such success don't simply feel envy. They develop moral condemnation. His wealth is sinful. His pride is offensive to God. His lack of humility shows poor character. What's happening here? The inability to express power directly becomes transformed into moral superiority. I may not be rich or powerful, the thinking goes, but I am good. And his power, rather than being simply power, is actually evil. Nietzsche wasn't suggesting we return to aristocratic values. Instead, he was exposing how moral language often masks power struggles and psychological needs. When someone insists something is absolutely wrong, they're often expressing something deeper than moral conviction. They're expressing their relationship to power. This investigation led Nietzsche to a startling question. If morality originated in power dynamics rather than eternal truths, what other aspects of our moral thinking might serve hidden purposes? What psychological needs does our belief in good and evil satisfy? And most importantly, if we recognize morality as a human creation rather than a cosmic truth, what possibilities might that open up? As we continue to follow Nietzsche's investigation, consider this. When was the last time you felt moral outrage? What power dynamics were present in that situation? And what would it mean if your moral reaction was not about accessing eternal truth, but about navigating your relationship to power? As Nietzsche's investigation deepened, he uncovered something even more fundamental about morality's origins, its intimate connection to fear. Behind our elaborate moral systems, he found a basic psychological reality. Humans are terrified by the unpredictable, the chaotic, the unknown. Moral frameworks don't just manage social hierarchies, they help us manage our existential anxiety. Consider primitive human societies facing natural disasters, disease outbreaks, or violent deaths. These events were terrifying precisely because they seemed random and meaningless. Early moral systems provided an explanation. Suffering was punishment for wrongdoing. By establishing this cause and effect relationship, humans created an illusion of control. If suffering comes from breaking rules, then following rules should keep us safe. Nietzsche observed this pattern across diverse cultures. Ancient Egyptian texts link flooding patterns to moral behavior. Greek tragedies show suffering as divine punishment for hubris. Medieval Christians interpreted the Black Death as God's judgment. Even today, when tragedy strikes, many ask, "What did I do to deserve this?" This isn't just seeking explanation, it's seeking moral explanation. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. We often prefer to believe in moral punishment than in randomness. A universe where suffering is deserved feels more manageable than one where it's arbitrary. As Nietzsche wrote, "Man would rather will nothingness than not will," meaning people would rather believe in a punishing moral order than accept that no order exists at all. But morality doesn't just explain suffering. It also domesticates our internal chaos. Humans contain powerful, contradictory drives, aggression, sexual desire, the urge for dominance. These instincts don't fit neatly into civilized society. Moral systems don't eliminate these drives but redirect them, often turning them inward. Nietzsche described this with a vivid metaphor in his book, Daybreak. Imagine early humans living in small communities, needing to suppress their aggressive impulses to coexist. What happens to those impulses? They don't disappear. They're internalized. The aggression that can't be expressed outwardly becomes self-criticism, guilt, and what we call conscience. This creates a profound paradox. The moral person isn't necessarily less aggressive than the immoral one. They've simply turned their aggression against themselves. Nietzsche saw the ascetic priest as the embodiment of this process, someone who appears supremely moral by waging constant war against their own nature. The severity of moral judgment often reveals the strength of the desires being suppressed. In his personal writings and correspondence with friends, Nietzsche observed this pattern in himself. When his health declined in the late 1870s, forcing him to resign his teaching position, he became increasingly isolated. During this period, he noticed how his physical suffering intensified his need for moral explanation. Pain demands meaning, and morality offers it. Nietzsche's insights extended to how moral systems perpetuate themselves. Once established, they create what he called the bad conscience, an internal monitoring system that makes us feel guilty for even questioning the moral framework. This creates a perfect self-protection mechanism. The very act of doubting morality becomes immoral. This is why moral revolutionaries throughout history are first condemned as immoral before being recognized as visionaries. By examining his own society in the late 19th century, Nietzsche identified how moral language had shifted from religious to secular forms while maintaining the same psychological function. Victorian-era concepts of respectability, decency, and civilization had simply replaced earlier religious notions while serving identical purposes: managing fear, controlling natural instincts, and maintaining social hierarchies. This investigation led Nietzsche to a startling insight. What we call morality is often fear disguised as virtue. The question then becomes, what would it mean to live beyond this fear? What possibilities might emerge if we recognized good and evil not as cosmic truths, but as psychological strategies? As we continue to follow Nietzsche's path, consider this. How much of your own moral certainty might be a response to fear? What anxieties are calmed when you divide the world into good and evil? And what might become possible if you could see beyond these categories? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a consistent pattern emerged across diverse moral systems throughout history. Despite their apparent differences, all moral frameworks share a common blueprint. They divide human potential into acceptable and unacceptable expressions, then redirect the unacceptable parts toward approved goals. This pattern became clear to Nietzsche as he compared different moral systems across cultures and time periods. In his work, Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, he examined how seemingly opposed moral frameworks, from ancient Greek ethics to Buddhist precepts to Christian morality to Enlightenment rationalism, all performed the same basic function. They tamed the human animal. Consider how different societies handle aggression. Spartan morality channeled aggression toward military glory. Christian morality redirected it towards spiritual warfare against sin. Victorian morality sublimated it into economic competition. Contemporary morality often transforms it into righteous activism. The instinct remains the same, only its expression changes. Nietzsche wasn't suggesting these redirections are necessarily bad. Human society requires some degree of instinct regulation. The problem arises when we mistake these pragmatic arrangements for cosmic truth, when we believe our particular moral framework reveals the universe's essential nature rather than our psychological needs. This confusion creates what Nietzsche called the longest lie, the belief that our moral judgments access something transcendent rather than emerging from very human, very earthly concerns. This lie prevents us from honestly examining what our moral judgments are actually doing, who they're serving, and what they're concealing. Nietzsche discovered something particularly revealing in how moral systems handle the concept of responsibility. Every moral framework requires believing that humans can have been different than they were, that the criminal could have chosen virtue, that the saint could have fallen into vice. This belief in radical free choice is necessary for moral judgment to make sense. Yet this belief contradicts what we know about human development. Our actions emerge from complex interactions between genetic predispositions, environmental influences, neurological patterns, subconscious drives, and countless factors beyond conscious control. Modern psychology, neuroscience, and sociology have only confirmed what Nietzsche intuited. The free moral agent is largely a fiction. Nietzsche wasn't denying human agency entirely. Rather, he was pointing out that moral responsibility requires an impossible level of freedom, the ability to have been fundamentally different than we are. He called this the metaphysics of the hangman, the need to believe someone could have been different so we can justify punishing them. This insight led Nietzsche to one of his most profound observations. Moral judgment doesn't just evaluate actions. It creates a particular kind of human being, one who experiences themselves as fundamentally inadequate. When we internalize moral frameworks, we develop what Nietzsche called the spirit of gravity, a constant sense of burden, of never being good enough, of always owing some unpayable debt. In his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883-1885, Nietzsche depicts this with the image of a camel, a beast that willingly kneels to be loaded with heavy burdens. This represents the moral person, eagerly taking on obligations, restrictions, and judgments against their own nature. The moral human becomes defined by what they must control, suppress, or overcome in themselves, rather than what they might create or express. The pattern becomes clearest when we examine how moral systems respond to exceptions. When someone lives successfully outside the moral framework, when they thrive while breaking the rules, moral systems typically respond in one of two ways. Either reinterpreting their success as actually failure, the rich man cannot enter heaven, or creating special exemptions that protect the rule, he's blessed by divine favor. This pattern of reinterpretation reveals that moral frameworks are not descriptions of reality, but prescriptions for managing it. They don't tell us what the world is. They tell us how to navigate our fears about what the world might be. By identifying this pattern, Nietzsche wasn't encouraging immorality or nihilism. Instead, he was clearing the ground for a more honest relationship with our values, one that acknowledges their human origins and psychological functions without treating them as cosmic commandments. But this raises a profound question. If morality isn't about accessing eternal truth, but about managing human psychology, what might lie beyond our current moral frameworks? What possibilities for human flourishing have been obscured by our belief in absolute good and evil? The implications of Nietzsche's investigation reach far beyond academic philosophy. If morality isn't cosmic truth but human creation, everything changes. Our relationship to guilt, to social institutions, to others, and most importantly, to ourselves. What Nietzsche uncovered doesn't lead to nihilism, but to a radical revaluation of all values. First, consider how this insight transforms our understanding of guilt. In traditional moral frameworks, guilt signals that we've violated some eternal law. But if morality is human invention, guilt becomes something different, not a metaphysical connection to cosmic order, but a psychological response to internalized social demands. This doesn't make guilt less real, but changes how we relate to it. Nietzsche explored this transformation in The Gay Science, 1882, where he introduces the concept of amor fati, love of fate, embracing everything that has happened as necessary rather than judging it against what should have been. This approach doesn't abolish responsibility, but shifts it from the past to the future. Instead of asking, "How have I failed?" we ask, "What will I create from here?" This shift has profound psychological implications. The person living beyond good and evil doesn't become immoral, but rather encounters life without the constant self-flagellation that moral systems demand. This isn't about indulging every impulse, but about relating to our impulses with curiosity rather than judgment. Socially, Nietzsche's insights reveal how moral language often disguises power relations. When we describe something as wrong rather than harmful to my interests, we invoke a fictional authority beyond human disagreement. This moral framing makes negotiation impossible. How can you compromise with absolute evil? By recognizing the human origins of moral claims, we can engage more honestly about what's actually at stake in our social conflicts. Consider how this plays out in contemporary debates. Climate activists frame environmental protection as a moral imperative. Industry advocates frame economic growth similarly. Both invoke absolutes to avoid the harder conversation about competing values and interests. Nietzsche would suggest that real progress requires moving beyond moral posturing to honest dialogue about what different groups actually need and want. Institutionally, Nietzsche's analysis helps us understand why social systems resist examination. Schools, churches, governments, and corporations all establish moral frameworks that conveniently align with their functions. Good students, parishioners, citizens, and employees are those who fulfill institutional needs. By framing these demands as moral rather than pragmatic, institutions make questioning them seem not just incorrect, but immoral. But the most profound implication concerns our potential for growth. Moral frameworks establish fixed identities: the sinner, the virtuous, the saved, the damned. Nietzsche saw these identity labels as cages that prevent becoming what he called the Übermensch, often translated as overman or superman. Not a superior person, but one who continuously overcomes themselves, creating new values rather than inheriting them. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes three transformations of the spirit: from camel, bearing moral burdens, to lion, saying no to imposed values, to child, creating new values in innocence. This evolution doesn't end in destruction, but in creation. Not in rejecting all values, but in generating values that affirm life rather than diminish it. This creative potential is what most distinguished Nietzsche's approach from nihilism. The person who sees beyond good and evil doesn't conclude that nothing matters. Instead, they recognize that nothing matters inherently. Meaning must be created rather than discovered. This places enormous responsibility on each person to determine what they will value and why. Nietzsche experienced this responsibility himself during his most productive period, 1883-1888. Despite worsening health problems and increasing isolation, he produced his most significant works during these years. His personal letters reveal that his liberation from conventional morality didn't lead to despair, but to a joyful, almost ecstatic creativity, even in the face of physical suffering. For Nietzsche, seeing beyond good and evil meant embracing what he called the eternal recurrence, a thought experiment asking whether you would choose to live your exact life infinitely many times. This isn't about wishing things were different, but affirming life exactly as it is, with all its pain and joy. This affirmation becomes possible only when we stop measuring life against what should be and embrace what is. But if morality has served such important psychological and social functions throughout human history, what happens when we recognize it as human invention rather than divine command? What takes its place? And why has this knowledge been so consistently suppressed? The greatest conspiracy Nietzsche uncovered isn't that a secret cabal invented morality to control the masses. It's something far more pervasive and subtle, a collective agreement to forget that we created morality in the first place. This conspiracy of forgetting serves everyone, the powerful who benefit from moral systems, and the powerless who find comfort in them. This collective amnesia isn't maintained through explicit deception, but through language itself. Notice how we speak about moral judgments. That's wrong, rather than, I disapprove of that. She's a good person, rather than, her behavior aligns with my values. Our very grammar implies moral judgments access objective reality rather than expressing subjective preferences. Nietzsche explores this linguistic conspiracy in his essay, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, 1873, where he examines how language creates the illusion of fixed categories in a world of constant flux. Moral language doesn't just describe reality, but constructs it, creating the impression that our judgments correspond to eternal divisions in nature rather than human perspectives. Educational institutions perpetuate this forgetting by teaching moral frameworks as discovery rather than creation. From childhood, we're taught to ask, what's the right thing to do, rather than, what values am I choosing to embody? This framing presents morality as something we find rather than something we make, hiding our role in value creation. Religious institutions have particularly strong incentives to maintain this conspiracy. If morality is human creation rather than divine command, religious authority is fundamentally transformed. This explains why Nietzsche's work faced such fierce resistance from religious quarters, not because it promoted immorality, but because it revealed morality's human origins. The conspiracy extends to philosophy itself. Even secular philosophers after the Enlightenment sought to ground morality in reason, nature, or universal principles, anything to avoid acknowledging its contingent human origins. Kant's categorical imperative, utilitarianism's greatest happiness principle, and contemporary appeals to rational self-interest all attempt to establish objective foundations for fundamentally subjective values. But why is this conspiracy so persistent? Why do even those who suffer under moral systems help maintain the illusion of their cosmic authority? Nietzsche found the answer in human psychology, specifically in our fear of responsibility. It's easier to follow rules than to create values. The person who recognizes morality as human creation must accept the tremendous burden of determining their own values without external validation. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes that people would rather will nothingness than not will at all, meaning people would rather follow destructive values than face the responsibility of creating their own. This insight explains why even oppressive moral systems often find willing participants among the oppressed. The certainty of imposed values is less terrifying than the freedom of self-creation. Consider how this conspiracy functions in contemporary society. Political movements frame their goals not as preferences, but as moral imperatives. Corporations don't just sell products, but lifestyles aligned with values. Even scientific endeavors are increasingly described in moral terms rather than pragmatic ones. This moral framing isn't accidental. It places certain questions beyond debate by making them matters of good and evil rather than competing interests. Nietzsche wasn't suggesting we could simply opt out of this conspiracy. It's embedded in our language, institutions, and psychology. Even attempting to live beyond good and evil requires tremendous psychological strength. This is why Nietzsche described his ideal reader as rare. Few people can bear the responsibility of creating values rather than inheriting them. The conspiracy's most effective aspect is its treatment of those who expose it. Throughout history, those who questioned dominant moral frameworks weren't engaged with intellectually, but condemned as immoral. This creates a perfect defense mechanism. The system uses itself to protect itself. Even suggesting morality as human creation becomes classified as a moral transgression within the system being questioned. Nietzsche experienced this firsthand. While he lived, his works were either ignored or mischaracterized as promoting nihilism and immorality. After his mental collapse in 1889, his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, gained control of his unpublished writings and deliberately misinterpreted them to align with her own anti-Semitic and nationalist views, precisely the kind of moral absolutism Nietzsche criticized. This misrepresentation reveals the final aspect of the conspiracy, the co-option of critics. Those who expose morality's human origins are either condemned or, more insidiously, reinterpreted to seem like they're proposing just another moral system rather than a fundamental reconsideration of morality itself. But if this conspiracy is so pervasive, so embedded in our thinking and institutions, why did it develop in the first place? What function does it serve? And most importantly, can we live differently once we recognize it? The truth Nietzsche uncovered about morality has been systematically obscured not through malicious conspiracy, but through institutional self-preservation and psychological necessity. Understanding why this knowledge has been covered up reveals its revolutionary potential. First, religious institutions have obvious reasons to suppress the idea that morality is human invention rather than divine command. If moral rules aren't handed down from above, but created from below, religious authority fundamentally changes. Religious leaders become interpreters of human tradition rather than messengers of divine will. While modern liberal theology might accommodate this view, traditional religious institutions cannot without transforming their core identity. Nietzsche observed this dynamic during his lifetime in 19th century Germany. As biblical criticism revealed the human origins and historical development of religious texts, religious authorities responded not by incorporating these insights, but by condemning the research as blasphemous. The need to maintain moral authority outweighed commitment to truth. Political institutions similarly depend on moral absolutes. Governments don't frame laws as pragmatic arrangements, but as implementations of justice. Nations don't describe wars as pursuing interests, but as defending good against evil. The moral framing transforms contingent political decisions into necessary moral actions, removing them from the realm of debate. Even revolutionary movements that challenge existing power structures typically don't question morality itself. They simply invert it, claiming the previously good is actually evil, and vice versa. This preserves the moral framework while changing its content. True revolutionary thinking would question the framework itself, which is why genuine moral innovators are rare compared to mere moral inverters. Educational institutions also perpetuate moral forgetting by teaching ethics as the study of what we should do rather than how moral frameworks function. Philosophy departments discuss which moral theory is correct, rather than examining morality as a psychological and social phenomenon. This approach presents morality as something we discover rather than create, hiding our role in value formation. But institutional motives are only half the explanation. The deeper reason this knowledge remains covered up lies in human psychology. Simply put, most people don't want to know. Recognizing morality as human creation places enormous responsibility on each person to determine their own values without external validation. Nietzsche explores this psychological resistance in Thus Spoke Zarathustra through the concept of the last man, someone who avoids this responsibility by seeking comfort and security above all else. The last man doesn't create values but consumes them, asking only, "What does everyone else believe?" This psychological type doesn't want freedom but consensus, not truth but belonging. In his personal life, Nietzsche experienced this resistance firsthand. His works received little attention during his lifetime, not just because they were difficult, but because they were threatening. His closest friend, Paul Ray, eventually distanced himself from Nietzsche's more radical ideas. Even Lou Salome, the brilliant young woman Nietzsche proposed to, ultimately rejected both his romantic advances and his philosophical direction, finding his questioning of moral foundations too destabilizing. The most profound reason Nietzsche's insights remain covered up is their implications for human identity. Traditional morality doesn't just tell us what to do, it tells us who we are. It creates stable identities: the good person, the sinner, the virtuous, the wicked. These identities provide psychological security even when they're painful. It's often more comforting to think of oneself as a sinner who might be saved than as a being with no fixed essence at all. Recognizing morality as human creation dissolves these fixed identities. The person living beyond good and evil doesn't have a stable moral identity, but exists in a constant state of becoming. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, they must become who they are, not by discovering a hidden essence, but by creating themselves through their choices. This explains why Nietzsche's ideas have been systematically misinterpreted. His concept of the Übermensch was distorted into a superior person rather than one who continuously overcomes themselves. His critique of morality was characterized as promoting immorality rather than examining morality itself. His vision of life beyond good and evil was portrayed as embracing evil rather than transcending the dichotomy entirely. These misinterpretations weren't accidents, but psychological necessities for those encountering ideas that threatened their fundamental sense of self. It's easier to dismiss Nietzsche as dangerous than to engage with his actual challenge, creating values consciously rather than inheriting them unconsciously. In our contemporary world, we see this same pattern of misinterpretation and dismissal. Those questioning dominant moral frameworks aren't engaged with intellectually, but condemned morally. This creates a perfect defense mechanism. The system defends itself by using its own standards to dismiss challenges to those standards. It's like trying to use the rules of chess to argue that we should play a different game entirely. What's most revealing is how Nietzsche himself has been treated by subsequent philosophical traditions. Academic philosophy has largely domesticated his thinking, treating him as one philosopher among many rather than someone questioning the very foundation of philosophical inquiry. His insights are discussed as interesting perspectives, rather than fundamental challenges to how we understand human values. Even more telling is how popular culture has misappropriated Nietzsche. His concept of the will to power has been reduced to crude dominance, rather than creative self-overcoming. His statement that God is dead has been treated as gleeful atheism rather than a profound diagnosis of cultural crisis. His vision of life beyond good and evil has been characterized as mere amorality rather than a more demanding ethical stance. Perhaps the most sophisticated cover-up comes from postmodern thinkers who acknowledge morality's human origins but then retreat into cultural relativism, the view that while moral systems aren't cosmic truths, they remain authoritative within their cultural contexts. This position seems to embrace Nietzsche's insight while actually neutralizing its revolutionary potential. It replaces cosmic authority with cultural authority, maintaining the basic framework of external moral validation. What all these responses share is avoidance of Nietzsche's central challenge. If morality is human creation, the question isn't which moral framework is correct, but what values we will consciously choose to create. This question places tremendous responsibility on each individual, a responsibility many would rather avoid through deference to tradition, consensus, or authority. This avoidance isn't weakness, but a natural psychological response to a genuinely terrifying prospect. Creating values without external validation requires tremendous internal strength. It means living without the comfort of moral certainty, without the security of fixed identity, and without the reassurance that we're definitively good people. Nietzsche himself recognized how difficult this path was. In his later works, particularly Ecce Homo, written in 1888 just before his mental collapse, he reflected on his own struggle to live according to his insights. Even for him, arguably the most penetrating psychological thinker of his era, maintaining this perspective required constant effort against internal and external resistance. This is why knowledge of morality's human origins has been covered up not just by institutions, but by individuals, not through conscious deception, but through psychological necessity. We hide this knowledge from ourselves, because facing it would transform our relationship to everything: our past actions, our social roles, our deepest sense of who we are. But if this knowledge is so destabilizing, so difficult to integrate, why should we confront it at all? What becomes possible when we recognize morality as human creation rather than divine command? This brings us to the final and most important question: what lies beyond good and evil? The final question isn't whether morality is human creation or divine command. The evidence Nietzsche uncovered leaves little doubt that moral frameworks emerge from human needs, fears, and power relations rather than cosmic truths. The real question is, what will you do with this knowledge? What becomes possible when you recognize your role not as moral rule follower, but as value creator? This recognition doesn't lead to nihilism or amorality, but to what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values. It's not about abandoning values, but examining them consciously, asking not just, is this right, but what life does this value serve? What kind of person does it create? What possibilities does it open or close? This approach transforms how we relate to ourselves. The person living beyond good and evil doesn't divide themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. They don't wage war against their nature in the name of moral purity. Instead, they ask how all their drives and instincts, even those traditionally condemned, might be channeled toward creative purposes. Nietzsche describes this integration in Twilight of the Idols as saying yes to life. This doesn't mean indulging every impulse, but orchestrating our impulses toward life-affirming goals. The aggressive drive that might become cruelty can instead fuel creative determination. The sexual energy that might become exploitation can power passionate engagement with life. Nothing in human nature is inherently evil. Only its expression can be life-denying or life-affirming. This perspective transforms how we relate to others as well. When we recognize that everyone's moral judgments emerge from their particular perspective, We become less concerned with proving others wrong and more interested in understanding what their values reveal about their needs and fears. Moral disagreement becomes a conversation about different ways of being human, rather than a battle between good and evil. In your own relationships, imagine the difference between telling someone they're wrong versus asking what needs or fears their position serves. The first approach creates defensiveness. The second opens possibility. This isn't moral relativism. Some values genuinely create more human flourishing than others, but it acknowledges that values serve human purposes rather than reflecting cosmic divisions. Most importantly, this recognition transforms how we engage with society. The person who sees beyond good and evil doesn't passively accept the values they're handed, but asks what these values do and whom they serve. They become capable of what Nietzsche called philosophizing with a hammer, testing inherited values to see which are hollow and which are sound. This critical stance doesn't mean rejecting everything. Nietzsche wasn't calling for destruction of all values, but for conscious creation of values that affirm life rather than diminish it. This is what distinguishes his approach from nihilism. It's not that nothing matters, it's that nothing matters inherently. Meaning must be created rather than discovered. What might this look like in practice? Instead of asking whether an action is right or wrong according to inherited rules, you might ask, does this choice expand or contract possibilities? Does it emerge from fear or creativity? Does it affirm life with its inevitable suffering and joy? Or does it seek escape from life's fundamental nature? This perspective doesn't make life easier. It makes it more demanding. Living beyond good and evil requires constant consciousness of what values you're embodying and why. There's no external authority to validate your choices, no cosmic guarantee that you're on the right path. This responsibility can be terrifying, which is why many prefer the comfort of conventional morality, despite its contradictions. But with this responsibility comes unprecedented freedom. Not freedom from values, but freedom to create values consciously, rather than inherit them unconsciously. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming philosophers of the future and free spirits, not people without values, but people who create values with full awareness of what they're doing. If you've stayed with me through this investigation, you're already showing the intellectual courage this perspective requires. You're willing to question what most take for granted, to look beneath the surface of our most fundamental assumptions. This willingness to question is the first step toward creating values consciously, rather than inheriting them unconsciously. I invite you to continue this journey by examining your own moral certainties. The next time you find yourself making a moral judgment, that's wrong. She shouldn't do that. This is evil. Pause and ask, what am I really expressing here? What fears or needs might be behind this judgment? What would it mean to move beyond this reaction toward more conscious value? Creation? This kind of philosophical self-examination isn't just academic, it's transformative. It changes how you experience yourself and the world. It doesn't make life simpler, but it makes it more authentic. It doesn't provide certainty, but it opens possibilities that remain closed within conventional moral frameworks. If this perspective resonates with you, I invite you to join our philosophical community by subscribing to this channel and activating notifications for future investigations. Each video explores different aspects of how we might live beyond inherited frameworks and create meaning consciously. Your comments and reflections enrich this ongoing conversation about what becomes possible when we see beyond good and evil. I'm particularly interested in hearing about moments when you've questioned your own moral certainties. What did you discover? What opened up when you looked beyond good and evil in your own life? Share your experience in the comments, and let's continue this investigation together. Remember, the goal isn't to abandon values, but to create them consciously, to become not just followers of philosophical ideas, but philosophers in your own life. As Nietzsche wrote, "One repays a teacher badly if one always remains nothing but a pupil." The greatest tribute to Nietzsche isn't to agree with his conclusions, but to engage in the same radical questioning he modeled. Thank you for joining me in this investigation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep creating, and keep becoming who you are.